Hello, I'm Richard Tyrone Jones. I'm a poet and a Cambridge graduate Ponce, and therefore a naturally very curious person. So when, aged 30, I found myself diagnosed with heart failure, a big heart, I decided not only to write a one-person show about it, Richard Tyrone Jones's Big Heart, but also, supported by the Wellcome Trust, to go out and interview some experts on heart failure to try and find out more. My heart almost died of dilated cardiomyopathy, and all I got was this lousy t-shirt cut up by the crash team. Oh well. So they could give yeast a weak heart. And that'd be cruel. So, genetics counsellor Marion Bartlett, what's your name and what do you do for a living?
Can I change it right from the very beginning?
Right,
because
yes.
The title's genetic counsellor without an S.
Genetic counsellor, yeah. Right, okay. So, genetic counsellor Marion Bartlett, what's your name and what do you do for a living?
I'm a health professional and I work with people who have inherited genetic conditions running in their family. So they might have a genetic condition, or one of their family members might have a genetic condition, and they want to know the chances of them developing it or the chances of them passing it on to their children. And a genetic counsellor deals with all of the human aspects of that. I worked at the Heart Hospital with families with inherited heart conditions, particularly hypertrophic cardiomyopathy. Although I also saw some families that had dilated cardiomyopathy, ARVC, arrhythmogenic right ventricular cardiomyopathy, and very occasionally families with arrhythmias like long QT and Brugada syndrome.
Yeah. So what kind of heart failure did I have? Well, I had atrial fibrillation, a regularly irregular, essentially a bebop heartbeat. A blood clot had formed inside my heart which could have broken off and caused a stroke or a heart attack elsewhere in my bloodstream. And lastly, dilated cardiomyopathy, basically the stretched, dilated, big, baggy, inelastic heart muscles of an old man. Is it very likely that they've inherited that from one or both parents?
For something like hypertrophic cardiomyopathy, yes, it is more commonly inherited than it is something that starts in that person for the first time. Dilated cardiomyopathy, less so, because there are lots of different causes of it, many of which are not genetic. So with dilated cardiomyopathy, I think it's up to about half is familial.
Yeah.
And of the genetic versions, it may be that genetic error has occurred in one person for the first time, or it's more likely that it's something inherited from one of their parents. What
percentage of unexplained idiopathic dilated cardiomyopathies are likely to be new mutations?
I'm not sure anyone knows that, because you would need to test everybody.
Yeah.
You need to test a large proportion of a large group of people who've got idiopathic DCM for all of the genes that we know about.
Yeah.
That would be expensive. So I suspect nobody knows.
How many genes for dilated cardiomyopathy are there that we know about?
Last time I checked there were 40, but cardiac genetics is a growing field.
Yeah, last time I checked there were 38, so you're already ahead of me on that. I'm not actually waiting for the results of the genetic tests. Like most cardiomyopathy sufferers, I'm waiting for the genetic tests themselves to become cheap enough that the NHS will actually fork out for them.
Just in the last few months, one of the NHS laboratories has started offering a test that looks at 13 cardiomyopathy genes in one go, and that's in the region of £1,000 to £2,000.
Wow. Given that I don't have the lamin AC gene, which is the most serious that can cause sudden death, but given that I do have 12 genetic progeny via sperm donation, Do you think that it would be worth my while investing that £1,000 to £2,000 to find out?
You may be able to get that test on the NHS. Probably the chances of it finding any particular mutation in you are quite small.
Yeah.
So a colleague of mine has done this test on someone else who has a similar history to you, and she thought that the pickup rate was about 5%.
Right.
Which means that if you were paying with your own money, there's 19 out of 20 chance that you would end up no further on than you are at the moment.
Right. No further on to find it. But
yeah,
it would rule out a few genes.
Yes.
Right, okay. So it was probably worth waiting a little while longer until they can do all of the identified genes. But then again, if they've identified about 40 genes that can cause dilated cardiomyopathy now, by the time the test for 40 genes becomes manageable in terms of cost, they'll have discovered another 40 genes and so on and so forth. It's it really is. Would you say that it's a case in genetics of the more you find out that you don't know?
Definitely. So my work was normally after the diagnosis has been made. So I would be perhaps seeing a healthy relative who wanted to find out whether or not they also had the disease-causing gene that had caused the cardiomyopathy in their family member. And the kind of people who'd come and see a genetic counsellor tend to be the ones who want to know.
Yeah.
So it's a bit of a bias sample. Common issues that come up are things like people feeling guilty for the possibility of having passed something like that on to their children, or even blaming their parents for passing it on to them. And obviously we don't have any choice about the genes that we inherit or the genes that we pass on.
There's 23,000 pairs of protein coding genes that must be copied to make up every human being. That's enough to guarantee that there's going to be transcription errors on some of them.
So there isn't theoretically any guilt or blame to be had, but that doesn't stop people from feeling that way. Listening to someone can be very powerful. Acknowledging how they feel, letting someone cry. People tell me things that they might never have told their best friend, so it's a huge privilege. But in terms of knowing that you have a genetic condition, some people find it helpful to know that we've all got different mutations in our genes, and that's just normal, that's part of being human. And it just happens that in their family you've identified what one of them is. Most people that I saw did want to know and had good reasons for wanting to know whether or not they had the predisposition to the condition, because if they don't have the genetic mutation for it, then they don't need to keep on having their cardiac screening. Yeah. Should I be allowed, with my conditions, to have children myself? Well, I say myself, with a woman, I mean. One that I've actually met. No genetic counsellor will ever tell you you're not allowed to have children. It's really unusual for someone to make their decisions about whether or not they're going to have children based on whether or not they have a genetic illness or a genetic predisposition. With some genetic conditions, people might decide to follow different paths in pregnancy, or for example, sometimes it's possible to do embryo selection and actually test, so use IVF techniques and test whether the embryo has got a particular genetic condition, and then with a view to only putting back into the womb an embryo that doesn't have the condition, so you can avoid passing it on. So people do sometimes want to avoid passing a condition on. Tends to be with more severe conditions, conditions that are related to intellectual disability or severe health problems in childhood. Are such selection procedures with IVF available on the NHS or privately for people who have cardiac inherited conditions? It's very rarely asked for cardiac inherited conditions in my experience. If there is a known disease-causing gene in the family, then it's theoretically possible. And in terms of funding for the embryo selection side of things, it's a process called pre-implantation genetic diagnosis, PGD. So PGD is funded on the NHS for some conditions, in some sets of circumstances, in some areas.
Yeah, it's a bit of a postcode lottery as much as it is a genetic one.
So, for example, we see very few families, very few couples who are deaf. No one would ever tell someone who's deaf not to have a deaf child or not to have children. But it's interesting that we don't see deaf people who have another genetic condition.
Right. So you could help deaf people with their other genetic conditions, and you wish that they would come in, but they're not doing so because of historically quite understandable fears. I think that it might save the NHS money in the long term if they knew what was likely to go wrong with them and started taking drugs preemptively.
Or I suppose in the case of cardiomyopathy, if you tested everybody, then you could screen all of the people that have the predisposition, and you don't have to waste money screening the people that don't. So, personally, the society argument would never sway me. Sometimes in my work, I see people who don't want to have a genetic test, and they're the person who have the condition in the family.
Right.
And we might have had contact from their family members who can't have a genetic test until their affected relative has had the test.
So you know what.
So we know what to look for. Yeah. And that creates an ethical dilemma. We would normally explain to the person who's chosen not to have the test exactly why it would be helpful for their relative, and sometimes that would be enough. They might even be willing to have a test but not want to know the result themselves.
That is a good third option, isn't it?
Yeah, so it's a kind of compromise option.
Apparently my heart hadn't technically stopped.
Of course, some people,
slowed down.
just talking to a genetic counsellor isn't enough, and they have to then, get up on stage and talk to whole rooms full of people about it, and generally make a bit of a song and dance about it. Is that acceptable behaviour in your opinion?
I think for some people it might just be the right thing to do.
Well, that's good to hear.
Cardiac genetics is a really fast-moving field, and it's pretty accurate. Especially the poem that lists numerous different genetic conditions that affect humans, apart from
dermatosparaxis,
which only affects horses. You put the American spelling for haemophilia.
Had I? So it's H-A-E.
Yeah.
classic galactosemia and sickle cell anemia, ataxia, haemophilia and beta thalassemia, propionic acidemia, hyperphenylalanemia, and autospondylomegaepiphyseal dysplasia.
And you've got muscular dystrophy in there twice.
Have
So,
I?
yeah, well, you've got myotonic dystrophy. Some people
Right.
think of as like a muscular dystrophy.
Okay. Myotonic dystrophy.
Which you've got as
Dystrophy myotonica, and hypochondroplasia, 5-Leiden thrombophilia, and hyperoxaluria methemoglobinemia.
no,
Or
it would
Duchenne.
be Duchenne muscular dystrophy, so it might mess
Duchenne.
with the scanning. Duchenne muscular dystrophy.
Okay.
Duchenne muscular dystrophy. You want to sing along? And Bourneville phacomatosis, perioral lentigenesis.
Can heart failure be cured by homeopathy?
No,
Are you sure?
fairly certain.
Acupuncture? Well, I'll be talking to Professor Anthony Mather, who's working on stem cells. So when stem cells are injected into you, they keep on growing and propagating, I believe, and affect the chemistry of the cells around them, so that they can maybe take over from other, we say defective cells, or cells that aren't doing their jobs properly in a genetic way. Some people have asked me if my heart failure is genetically related to my ginger hair. It's not, is it?
Normally, Richard, it's gingers like you that break all the hearts.